So I get to formally welcome you. We are recording tonight for review and for use later, and we'll make it available through our website for folks that want to engage and check in and participate later. Everybody on this call is built in the image of God and we are meant to be the ethnicity and from the families of origin that we were born into. We were created just as God intended, skin tone and all. And our desire on this call is not to beat anybody up or to create anybody or to despair anybody or any particular people. We really want to create a safe space for everyone. We do want to address our identities and our connectedness. Oftentimes when we get into these conversations, there's this sense of individual identity. And I will say specifically, and often for white folks, we declare that's, I'm not that, or that's not me. But we can both be individual and we can be part of a collective. In fact, we're both. We're both an individual, Steve, and I'm a white male as a part of a collective. And sometimes the anger or frustration that one person is expressing is not necessarily anger or frustration at you. Sometimes I've experienced it. It can be at me and it can be my fault and I need to deal with it. But sometimes people are just making an issue that they've experienced with the collective identity and not necessarily the individual. There are behaviors and systems and structures in our society at large that are unjust and that don't recognize the image of God in all people. And that's really what we're on this call and want to address in this call and our future calls. We invite everybody to take a listening posture, to seek to understand before being understood. My best example of this is my own marriage. When I feel like I need to defend myself, or if I say something my wife doesn't agree with and I try to keep repeating it or keep trying to get her to listen, I often don't get anywhere. But if I just stop and listen and own, rather than defend, I get a lot farther along in my marriage. And so our hope tonight is that everyone would take a listening posture and that we would really invite you to sit in this space with us and not necessarily try to right away answer or get defensive or try to respond. The other attitude that we really want to encourage everyone is to have an attitude of confession and repentance when we have an aha moment, and then to take that to a deeper level, both individually and corporately. We have a couple of lessons we've learned from what's called Courageous Conversations and some guidelines we've put together. There's a few of them, and they say one of them is own your own truth. Don't assign truth to others. So it's not, you did this, but it's own my own truth. A big one is accept non-closure. This is a lifelong journey. We're not going to solve it all tonight. We're not going to solve it all in one setting. We may not solve it in our lifetime, but we're going to push forward on this journey together. Become comfortable with being uncomfortable. We spend a lot of time in our lives trying to find ways to be comfortable, and I want to encourage us all to become a little more uncomfortable when we want, our shoulders curl and we get uncomfortable. Be careful to sit at that. In the Crucial Conversations things, we often say, stay at the table. My encouragement for us is stay on the Zoom call. Like, stay engaged as much as you can. Stay in relationship. And again, I already said this once, but listen with the intent to learn and understand. Don't listen with the sense of necessity to have to jump in and respond. So a couple of ground rules that we're going to set, and we already talked about one of them. We want this to be a safe space for all. So we're going to ask that you really respect the individual people and allow them to have their opinions. Agree to believe the best in people and to give them your full attention. Please stay muted unless invited to unmute. And please don't interrupt, but allow people to finish their sentences if and when we're in a discussion framework. If offended, speak to it, but how it made you feel, but speak with grace and truth. Often we encourage people to make I statements, not you statements. The chat room is an interesting room. If you're not familiar with the Zoom, there's a chat button. The chat is a place where you can engage with us while we're talking. And we kind of use the chat room as the amen corner. If you've been to a Pentecostal church or often a Black church and you've experienced folks who while the sermon is going on, people are saying amen. And, they're kind of agreeing. They're stating the agreement with what they heard. Sometimes you can even say, ouch, or, ooh, that's uncomfortable. But we don't want the chat room to become a place where we're debating the presenter or debating each other, and it's no longer a safe place because people are trying to kind of argue on the chat room. We'd like to not use it for that tonight. We will let you know we're going to have some questions throughout tonight, and we want you to, when we ask those questions, to respond in the chat room. And then from the responses in chat, we'll call a few of them out and say, would you speak more about this? Or let's address this question, and we might refer it back to Pastor Harvey or to open it up for the person to expound on their question. We'll also be offering a survey at the end. In fact, the survey is on the chat line right now. Obviously, it'll be there, and I put it there so I can remember to cut and paste it later on or refer to it so that we can link to the chat again. So we just want to invite you to join us in this conversation. We're excited to be here. We've been talking about this for a while. We didn't do as good at getting out and getting it put out. So we're really excited that we've got, 25 folks or so on the call, and we're going to try to, as much as we can have dialogue, we will do it. Our format is going to be that we've got 3 different topics that we're going to discuss, and Pastor Harvey's going to have a presentation. We'll watch some video. I'll have a chance to respond some to his presentation and to issue a question, and then we're going to have you engage in the chat box. We'll bring that to a close. We'll go to our next topic. And so we have 3 of these sections that we think will each take about 20 minutes and leave us lots of room for some discussion and even discussion at the end. So it's those 3 segments that they'll be working into. And I mentioned Pastor Harvey, and I just wanted to give a chance to say that it has been my joy to connect with him. In 1985, we met both doing youth work, and we had a chance to connect with one another and engage with one another, and have started to work together. He's been one of the people that's helped me unpack and wrestle with my whiteness and all of my privilege and history and all the things that just naturally I grew up with. And I just am really honored to be hosting this call with him and to be engaging with him in this work. And I'm excited to we're going to do this now on the first Tuesday of every month moving forward, and we'll keep going as long as the discussions keep being vibrant and the issues keep coming to the table. Our plan is in the future to invite some other speakers and to have a kind of a panel discussion with other speakers tonight. He's our main speaker, and we'll be doing most of the presentations, and I'll be hosting and asking for some responses and having some conversation. Thank you for the person in the chat that said, not the first Tuesday, the first Thursday. This is Thursday. Forgive me. We started the idea of this being Tuesdays, and I still have it in my brain. So without further ado, let me introduce Pastor Harvey Drake. He's the senior pastor of Emerald City Bible Fellowship. He's also the president and founder of Urban Impact, and somebody that I'm honored to call a friend and somebody who I've been able to sit under and learn from. So Pastor Harvey, welcome. Hope I got to get you unmuted.
Thank you all for being with us tonight. I'm delighted that you have chosen to get on this journey with us, because that's exactly what it is. And I've been in the past, maybe a year or so, meeting with various pastors, particularly pastors of large white churches, and I've been asking this single question: what's it going to take for us to become or live into the family of God that God called us to be? And that's a question that we all need to begin to grapple with and wrestle with, because ultimately God's design and vision for us is that we would be united and that we would be one. And for some reason, we've allowed some other things to enter into the picture that has hindered us from being what God called us to be. And so I'm just grateful that we can begin this journey together. We're going to start this first segment by talking about a few definitions. I would imagine when I use the word racism and ask you to define it, I'm almost guaranteed to get more than 5, if not 10 definitions of racism. And because we don't have a common language and understanding of what terminology is, it adds to the confusion. So this first segment is going to be about us taking some time to come up with some common definition. We may not get all of them tonight, but I am going to help us to grapple with that just a bit. And so the first thing I want to do is ask you, have you ever heard of the phrase cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation? Can you tell me what the difference is between being a non-racist and an anti-racist? What are microaggressions? And when are we committing microaggressions toward one another? Well, in fact, what is privilege or advantage? We hear a lot about white privilege these days. And if we're honest, it makes some of us start quaking and shaking when we hear that, right? And so those are some of the terms that we need to begin to get some handles on, because I believe that when we're sitting in a room, that we have to have a common understanding, common language, so that when we hear a term or phrase, we don't land on 10 different images, because that's what, again, adds to the confusion. So what I like to do is to help us understand this, is like to have Steve put on a video. It's a 6-minute video, it'll be an easy video to watch, and it's gonna define for us racism and racism. Steve, would you hit the video, please?
In light of all that's taking place today, there are so many questions. The division, the conflict, the misunderstanding. I thought I would take a moment to address one of the subjects that regularly comes up that people are confused about, and that is, what is systemic racism? Well, first of all, let's define racism. Racism is the conscious or unconscious belief in the superiority of one's race over and against another race. That feeling, that belief, gets manifested in the use of power or influence or resources or even communication that seeks to reject or marginalize or even oppress a person of another color, race, or ethnicity. When we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the presence of racism, as we've just defined it, being embedded into the structures of society, whether those structures are political or economic or legal or medical or related to housing or employment. It is where it has become part of the policies or procedures of a way a particular entity operates. Of course, we're all aware of the evil system of slavery. That was a legal system that oppressed a group of people because of the color of their skin. But that got embedded into other structures in society. For example, criminal justice. There was a practice called peonage or debt servitude, where after the 13th Amendment was established granting freedom to slaves, there was a clause that said unless you're a criminal. So what was done was the criminalizing of men for the most minor of infractions, so that the 13th Amendment could not be applied. And they would be held in servitude, oftentimes way beyond what they were arrested for, and many times they were arrested for little or nothing, in order to keep them from being able to claim the freedom that was being granted by the 13th Amendment. It showed up in the way people were denied employment or educational opportunities, or being able to access the goods and services during Jim Crow segregation. It showed up in churches that were unwilling to accept people of a different race because of the color of their skin. Or I can speak personally when I was told when I was trying to enter into the media ministry that a black speaker would offend too many of our white listeners. There was a system at work that was denying equal opportunity and equal access. Those systems, while a person may not be personally a racist, can be supported by supporting the structure that is that way. And unless you're not only not a racist, but that you speak against racism where it shows up, they can continue to be part of the fiber of a particular way a particular structure operates. When you understand that in a race, some people, if they are allowed to get started quicker and faster, or start at a starting point much ahead of where another group is, that the group behind has to play catch up. And at least being empathetic and sympathetic, that has been a historical reality, not only in people's personal views, but in the structures that people have believed in, supported, affirmed. Then you understand why there is a catch-up that needs to take place. And when you understand that, appreciate that, and grasp that, it does give you a different sensitivity to the reality. Now, of course, that sensitivity must be handled in not only in an empathetic way, but a responsible way. But at the same time, just knowing that people have been held back, people of color have been held back by structures, not just by individuals, helps you to understand why certain elements within our society need to be corrected so that equal opportunity is granted, the granting that God gives all men and the granting that the United States offers to all of us as well.
Thank you, Steve, for playing that video. We wanted to show that video because it gives us an opportunity to grapple with the practice of what racism might be. If you've ever gone to the Undoing Institutionalized Racism workshop that the city of Seattle has been sponsoring for years, and various other groups around the country, they will define racism as race prejudice plus power. And thus the argument ensues whether or not people of color can actually be racist, because we would argue that they don't have the power in this country to control many things. This, I believe, gave us a pretty clear and succinct definition of what racism is and how it has been played out in our country. So, but I think what we have to really grapple with is that the power and control is probably the most dominant theme in racism. When you think about it, because it's all about who controls, who leads, who manages, who sets the rules, who makes the decisions. And when you apply that also to the meaning, you'll discover soon that racism really is a sin, but it crosses all lines of ethnicity. When you think about some of the Hutus and the Tutsis and all that was going on in Rwanda, you have Africans fighting Africans. You think about what went over in Bosnia and Yugoslavia and all that took place there. Those were not people of different races. They were the same race, right? And you look at what's been happening in Ireland for years, right? Protestants and Catholics. And when you really boil it down, what God wants to do or needs to do is change our heart, because it becomes more about sin than it is about skin. But when you overlay race on top of it, it adds a couple of other layers of complexity. And so in this segment, we just wanted to say, we have to begin to think about a language, and we have to begin to understand how we can define certain things. So I mentioned the term anti-racist versus non-racist. And non-racist is the person who endeavors not to consciously say or do racist things, and thus add to the evil or the wrong that's already going on. So we know it exists, but I'm not gonna aggravate it. I'm not gonna instigate it. I'm not gonna add to it. The anti-racist, on the other hand, is the person who actively works against racism in all forms. That means they're interrupting a cultural insensitive joke, initiating conversations with friends and family members who hold racist views, or leading discussions and prayers at church, and a host of other actions. My dad is 28 years my senior. My younger son is 28 years my junior. And I never will forget the day I picked my sons up from junior high school. They hopped in the back seat because obviously dad was a chauffeur. And they began to mimic and mock Southeast Asian students. And I can remember slamming on my brakes and turning around. I had wind in my chin and my lips were tight. And I said, don't you ever talk derogatorily against somebody of another race. And then obviously I began to talk about some of our own history in America. It was obviously tougher when I had to have that conversation with my father about the way he talked about Asians and Hispanics and the way we talked about whites. And so I was actively trying to undo some of the forms that we saw regularly. And so that's the difference between a non-racist and an anti-racist, right? We all know what bigotry is. It's intoleration. And so this point is really to say, let's work at trying to understand how to adequately define terms and phrases so that we can move this conversation forward. Our hope is that at the end of this, we will move closer together and not further apart. I think I'll open it up for questions.
Well, and let me, before I ask kind of the question in chat, or actually while I'm speaking, I'll put this question in the chat box. The question that we thought of after this section was, which of the words that Pastor Harvey mentioned triggers you or causes you questions? Or are there other words that trigger you or cause questions for you when you hear them? I was going to add that, I don't know what it was. I was coming out of college in the early 80s, and I was moving into North Portland, and everything in me wanted to do good and to engage with kids of color and kids in the city, kids that often didn't have youth ministry opportunities. For those that know the Portland area, I was moving into like Irvin and what's now ML King. It was, at that time, it was really hard for me whenever anybody approached the idea that I was a racist or I was privileged, and really white privilege wasn't even much used as a term back then. But language is really important. But it caused me to, no, I'm not. You're like, I have a good heart. I have a right attitude. And the first time that I stepped into the living room and used the classic N-word with my two African-American roommates, and they sat me down, the whole room got quiet, and they said, sit down. I think they might have said, sit down, white boy. And they begin to talk about that word. And, my first response was, yeah, but you guys were, that's the whole conversation. You guys were using it back and forth. You guys were engaging in this language, and at the end of the conversation, they basically said, you got a lot to learn. And if you choose to use this word, and we're playing basketball at Irvington Park, we won't throw punches, but you're on your own. And if you can't learn, if you can't be willing to engage and hear us, you'll learn quickly that day. And you need to understand, and it began me on a journey to realize that there was a ton of language and attitudes in me. I've been in this work now since then, so almost 40 years. And I would say that I'm understanding more and more every day about the racism that's in me and the prejudice that's in me than I understood back, when I was naively and passionately wanting to engage. The first day I held the door or Harvey held the door for me, and we had come back from a meeting, and it just came out of my mouth, that's mighty white of you. And he looked at me and he said, excuse me? What did you just say? And what did it mean? And I said, that was mighty white of you. So what does it mean to be white? And I was like, I don't even know where that came from. My friends, we used to say it all the time. I'm not sure where the phrase originated, but it came out in me in that situation. And he helped me unpack. So what is an attitude? So what you're saying, I'm polite. You're saying I'm being, gracious. What is it when you're spitting these things out in you? And I've been very fortunate to have some very, very good friends that have approached both language and the attitudes behind language that exist in me. And so as you respond to this question in the chat box, what are the words that trigger you, or what are the words that you'd like some more understanding of? Non-racist category. Somebody asked the question, Pastor. Maybe you could jump in there and give us a little more, unpack that a little bit more.
I don't understand the non-racist category. I would say, and I get in trouble when I say this out loud to some people and to some groups, I don't believe that all whites are racist, right? And because not all whites are racist, we can be a non-racist in that we don't individually perpetrate or offend people intentionally, but we allow things around us to go on, and we don't say anything about it. We don't challenge it. So that's the non-racist category. So you're not the one out there throwing the punches, but you don't stop those who are. Whereas the anti-racist is that person who will say, wait, hold up, that should not be. We need to change that. We need to reconsider that. Let's redefine that, or let's stop the other. So does that help?
That's helpful. You're getting lots of nods. I would add that Pastor Harvey, I think, is being gracious in saying that not all whites are racist. I would say that as a part of being in a white dominant system, white majority, and that I have racist upbringings, and there are racist attitudes, and that as a white person, I generally don't understand some things that make me often behave in ways that are racist. I appreciate not being labeled a racist, but I think racism is as much a part of my existence as a white person, and the privilege I participate in could be labeled as racist. I would like to think that I was non-racist when I started. I now understand I am racist, and I'm working to be an anti-racist. But that racism is clearly a part of the privilege and the experience that I have deep within me.
In the system in America. That's our reality. We'll say a bit more about that later on.
Pastor, there's another question here about systemic racism, and that many people wrestle with the idea that systemic racism doesn't exist, and that it doesn't look the same for all races.
Okay, is that the one? Say that
Toward
again.
the bottom.
Okay.
The idea that systemic racism doesn't exist, and that some people see things just individualistically and not as systemic.
Which is, if we're honest, which is part of the problem, because we have been conditioned in America in particular to be very individualistic rather than community oriented. And so if we don't do it directly ourselves, we go, oh, well, I'm not it, or it doesn't actually exist or happen, right? And proximity is something that we have to grapple with here, because if I've not seen it directly with my own eyes, I have a very strong tendency to say, I don't know if I can believe that. I don't know if that actually happens, right? So a lot of people claim individual pardons. That's just not me. I loved everybody, right? I love everybody. I'm nice to everybody. But at the same time, we still have to understand that there is a system that we have been privy to and advantaged by, which is what Steve is really trying to say, even if we say we aren't individually, because we have not addressed the larger system that exists. That happens. Let me help you understand this. There are 101, at least 101 historical Black colleges and universities. You know why we have so many of those? Because in the early years, Blacks were not admitted into white universities. There are Bible institutes all over America because there was a period when Blacks were not allowed into white theological institutions. In fact, Dr. Tony Evans, the gentleman we just heard on the video, he was the first African-American to get a doctorate degree from Dallas Theological Seminary, which is a highly prominent seminary here in America. And I'm going, really? You know, and so but because the system was in place, people benefited from that system. And that's why we have to work to bring some balance between personal happenings and then the group happenings. We're all a part of it. I could say I've never assaulted a white woman, and I can exonerate myself from that. But at the same time, I have to say there have probably been some black guys who have assaulted a white woman. But I can't say, well, it doesn't exist because, or that's not my fault. And if I'm not talking to young men about not doing that, then I become complicit in the act itself. And that's where silence becomes critical. But we'll say more about silence as we move forward.
I think the last thing I'll share, and we're going to transition to our next section, and our next section is called Speaking the Truth in Love, Let's Be Honest.
Oh.
And prior to that, I want to wrestle with this idea that racism as sin is just that. And most of us in this call, we've promoted this among Christian community, and I would say that's, if not everyone on the call, most of the people on the call identify as being Christian. If I was to say that I'm a sinner and that I was born into sin, we'd all go, yeah. And we would be able to say, some folks walk in that lifestyle much more, and you could identify the activities of their sin, but that we would all agree that sin is just a part of who we are. And I think I see racism very much the same, that I was born as a white male into a system and a structure that has an inherent in it racist ideas and structures and biases and privilege, and that everyone was born into a similar system, and that system is broken, and that system exists, and I'm a part of it. And that's kind of when people get after, not individually, there are times where I feel pretty good about my lifestyle, and I go, maybe I'm a Pharisee now, but I think I'm doing better at sinning or not sinning. Mm-hmm. But I think that in general, I never get over being a sinner. I always have to grow more and more in a lifestyle that's less sinful. And racism is very similar at that level for me. But Pastor, take us to this next topic. Speaking the truth in love, let's be honest.
Speaking the truth in love. So if you get a hold of the copy of the book called The Color of Compromise, written by a gentleman by the name of Jemar Tisby, Tisby, and the title is The Truth About American Churches' Complicity in Racism. If you get a copy of the book, you read it forward by a young African-American hip-hop artist named Lecrae. Lecrae tells the story of a tweet he made on July 4th, 2016. And it all started, he said, when his social media feeds filled up with posts of American flags and photos of friends' backyard barbecues celebrating America's independence. Lecrae then tweeted a picture of 7 African Americans picking cotton in the field with the following caption: "My family on July 4th, 1776. Lecrae said that his tweet was retweeted more than 15,000 times, and he received more than 23,000 likes. And some of the likes included a number of tweets that were frustrated by the fact that he chose to post such an image and caption on the day celebrating America's independence, right? One follower questioned Lecrae's patriotism. Another accused him of making everything or every issue about race instead of about the gospel. And from where Lecrae was sitting, he was simply telling the truth. He was telling the truth about our country's complicated, imperfect history on a day when people were celebrating, he would say, in a simplistic, incomplete narrative about our country. And so we wanted to get into this section about speaking the truth, but speaking the truth in love and trying to figure out what does it mean to really be honest. The Bible tells us that that in Ephesians chapter 4, that quarrels happen and fights happen because of our immaturity. It also states very frequently that we ought to speak the truth in love, not to be tossed to and fro, back and forth like infants, blown by every wind and teaching by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming, but instead speak the truth in love. And then again in that chapter, it also says that we must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. And the reason I started with Lecrae's comment in this forward is because that's a problem that we have right now in terms of speaking the truth in love. And so this is what I was challenging people through a sermon not long ago. I wanted to say to my white brothers and sisters, stop denying and looking away from our history and its current realities. Because there are still people who don't believe that some of the things that Black and brown people communicate are real. Well, are you sure that really happens? And then we have to stop denying the privilege or the advantage that we've had over the years over Black and brown family members. And I call them family members because I want us to get to this place where we stop seeing each other as enemies, but see each other as family, as God designed it, right? And then we have to stop saying it's all individual and realize that some of this stuff is collective, whether we are responsible for it directly or not. We have to stop denying that, right? The reality is that the church probably could have stopped slavery and or racism as we know it today had we stood up and said, from a biblical perspective, we're all human beings in the sight of God. We would never have allowed the country to classify the people who were enslaved as 3/5 of a person. And so rather than deny or hoard your advantage, I'm encouraging people to use that advantage, right? Another thing about speaking the truth is this. What I say to African Americans is, let's stop blaming whites for all the problems we have in the world. Now, I say this tongue in cheek to white men, you cause a lot of problems, but not all the problems. For instance, Seattle Public Schools has the 5th largest achievement or opportunity gap, as they call it now, in the nation, not just the state, right? The 5th largest. So you have to ask what's going on in that system where only 34% of the people with my paint job read at grade level. But Seattle is considered a pretty high performing district. And it is for white and Asian students, but it is not for Black and brown students. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? So there are some systemic issues that need to be addressed, but at the same time, if I'm honest, I have to say that some of the kids don't perform well because some of the parents, not all, have been negligent and have not prepared their students for learning. For instance, my wife, the first year of her 27-year career in education, taught kindergarten. And she was surprised at the number of parents from our neighborhood who never came to the school, never looked at their students, never came to teacher-parent conferences, and the number of those kids who showed up who did not know their letters or how to spell their name or how to read a single word or phrase. And she's going, are you kidding me? And so then before they get there, who's responsible for them? The parents are. So if we're being honest, and this is what I think God calls us to, we have to speak the truth and we have to speak it in love. We have to be honest that in some way we all are complicit in the ongoing struggle that we have when it comes to race. So I'm saying be honest, white brothers and sisters, that you've enjoyed a system that had given you an advantage over Black and brown family members. And I'm saying to Black folk, be honest, you can't blame white people for everything, right? My mother died, as some of you know, as a heroin addict at the age of 39. Somebody brought the heroin into our neighborhood. Somebody in our neighborhood sold the heroin and gave it to my mother, right? Some of us didn't get hooked on it because all of us did not indulge in that, right? So some of us have to take responsibility to say, well, it may be here, but guess what? I'm not buying it. Guess what? I'm not taking it. Guess what? I'm not going to indulge in it. And so all I'm saying is there's a space and a place for us to speak honestly about, what's happening in our country right now and in our families and in our lives. I think I've said enough just to whet our appetites.
I'll take on so you can look at your phone some more and get that message.
I've got notes on my phone. Okay, I don't have two screens in my house, so I've got the computer up and I got my phone up. So I'm reading something off of my phone and something off the screen. Thank you.
When I think about the truth in love, I think sometimes the love and the truth that we need to tell is acknowledging the truth within ourselves. And I really appreciate Pastor Harvey's kind of challenging us to think about what are the general truths. And, you know, at some point, America has to come to grips with what some call our original sin, and the sin of slavery, and acknowledge the fact that for hundreds of years, you know, this terrible evil was both endorsed by and present in our cities and our society, and there's no way around it. And we got to get over this idea that, well, I didn't, and not in my time frame. And, you know, you buy a house with a bad roof and you live in it for 10 years. At some point, the roof becomes your responsibility, and you got to address the roof and own it as a problem, and you got to get after it. And I think that as Americans, we have to do a little truth telling and own it. You know, we have to deal with the fact that Mount Rushmore is a monument built on sacred land that was treated to the Native Americans and then stole back from them, and we placed a monument of four white men, all of whom have issues of their own kind of racist ideologies, and we can't seem to own and be honest about it. But I think some of that, sometimes we have to be honest just with ourselves. When the George Floyd killing came out and the video came out with George Floyd, my wife, who happens to be African American, sent me a text of that murder, and she showed it to me, and I'm watching this officer with his knee on George Floyd, and if I'm honest to myself, the first thought came to my mind: what did he do to deserve that and to warrant that level of police control? And I placed the blame on George Floyd. That was what my initial response was. Now, as I watched the rest of the videos, as I started to intellectualize what I was thinking, I started to realize this man was compliant. There's nothing he did wrong. This was murder. But that was not the truth to my original thought. When I say that there's racism in me, I have to acknowledge the fact that that was my response. My dear friend, Pastor Harvey, my dear wife, had a visceral emotional response to what they were watching. And I've talked to a number of other African American friends who saw that video, and something gripped their spirit. And it wasn't, I wonder what he must have done to deserve that. It was, we're watching a lynching, we're watching a person be murdered, and everybody's standing around and nobody cares because he's Black. And I have to own that as a part of my psyche, and I have to address it. And what I would hope for my white brothers and sisters on this call and in the work that I'm doing today is that we would be honest with the attitudes that we possess in ourselves, because I don't think it's a 12-step process. I don't think we're going to come to healing of the racist ideologies when we can never be honest with what's in us and which is true about ourselves. And I think that's a key first step, is speaking the truth to ourselves. I've placed a couple more questions in the chat box, if I can get it to do it here. And they are, when do you find it most difficult to speak the truth? When do you find it most difficult to speak the truth? And what areas do you wish folks would own the truth about? What are some of the things that you wish folks would own the truth about, specific, again, staying on the topic of this issue of race? Take a moment and throw a comment in the chat box.
There's a question here, and I'm going to put it out, and then we can maybe come back to it. It says, how do we engage white folks who are poor and don't see the difference between their opportunity versus an African American who is also poor, who believes systemic racism doesn't exist as a system, as it looks the same for all races?
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, I would love to speak to that in a minute, but I'll let you all get your questions down in this section here.
I appreciate some of the comments here. When it's close to home is when it's hard to hit. I think that's true for me. When I realize that I'm complicit in what I'm telling the truth about, it's easier to hold it. It's when I've lied about it a little bit, it's harder to tell the full truth when I know that I'm complicit in the wrong. Reparations, it's being hard to talk about. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
When I think it might cost me a friendship, whew, that's a hard one.
Very, very much.
I appreciate that honesty. I'm not planning to go and shooting anybody, but I'll always cover my pocket when I'm walking by an African-American man.
This is a comedy club. I would say me too. Sorry, it's not a comedy club. Sorry. Yeah, these are very good questions. Steve said something as we're still cogitating. He said something about America's original sin. Some are beginning to say that the original sin of America was not slavery. It was greed. Because it was greed that led to slavery. The desire for free labor, the desire to increase their capacity and their bounty. And therefore it led to the mistreatment of people so that they can build their asset base. That's what some are saying now. The original sin was not slavery, but rather greed. And when you think about colonization, particularly as you think about the continent of Africa and how the French went in and the Dutch went in, the British went in, how the Belgians went in. And I've been to Belgian Congo several times. That's what it was originally called. It was Belgian Congo, then it was Zaire, then it went back to Congo. Now it's the Democratic Republic of Congo, and how rich they were in resources and how the countries were stripped of their resources, natural resources, by those who colonized them. In fact, I should have kept up with my French classes that I started in 4th grade, but dropped out in 7th grade because I didn't like the teacher, because I didn't know God was going to have me involved in Francophone countries in Africa. So I get to Congo and they speak French, and I'm going, oh man, I could speak to them directly how to keep my French up. And we see that scenario because of colonization. That's something we don't always want to think about or even admit, that some of those countries have been pillaged and all of their natural resources have been removed and taken from them and inured to the benefit of not the African people, but those who colonized them.
A couple more questions. The question about are the things that not questions, but things that make it tough to talk about or tell the truth about the all lives matter conversation, or that people sometimes use patriotism as a way to sustaining a racist mindset. Mm-hmm. Those are all really challenging.
Yeah, they're extremely.
Stop conceptualizing America as a great, exceptional country that doesn't acknowledge the truth of our history. Yeah.
Yeah. So it goes back to the picture that Lecrae, the Christian hip hop artist, tweeted back in 2016, and how people got upset about that, because there are some things that we just want to forget about and not engage with at all. And so when you talk about the whole idea of reparations, folks really get up in arms. I mean, let's think about it. You've done it for a few other groups. And there's one billionaire, black billionaire, who's talking about reparations. He said, because think about all the free labor you got all those years from the ancestors of people who are here today. They weren't paid for it at all, but you got it. And you got wealthy off of it as well. And so when we're honest, we have to go, maybe there's some truth to something like that. Now you mentioned let's see. Yeah, we are powerful all over the world. Yeah, there's another question that came up. Oh, wow, Caroline, wow. 2 to 10 million people died when the Belgians colonized the Congo, forced the Congolese people to supply rubber and diamonds. In fact, Belgium is one of the #1 producers of diamonds even today.
Pastor, time-wise, let's take it to the last section, and then we'll open up some at the end for those who are eager to process out loud a little bit. We'll open up the mute, and in the next, we'll ask people to be polite and wait for folks to speak and respond, but we'll create a little more open dialogue if we can do that with 30 people. But church's role in racial history. Tell us about some of your thoughts on that and how the church is complicit even today.
So if you haven't seen the book, The Color of Compromise, this is one you need to pick up. What he does is he basically chronicles the American church's role in racism down through since our beginning, really. And I think it's Jemar Tisby, along with others, who basically say we probably again would not be grappling with racism as we do today had the church asserted itself and stood up and said no to the fact that it was done. Slave owners, well, some of our great Americans were slave owners. In order to justify the mistreatment of those who were enslaved, again, they had to downgrade their humanity. The Bible never gives us the ability or the freedom to downgrade anyone's humanity, because the Bible that I read and love states very clearly from the very beginning that God created us all in his image and his likeness. And you never find the loophole that we've been living with for eons now that says the Chinese woman or the Greek man or the African woman or the Polish man were created in God's image. You don't find it in the Greek, you don't find it in Hebrew, you don't find it in the Ugaritic, you don't find it in the Akkadian, you don't find it in Aramaic, you don't find it in any of the Sumerian languages, because it is not there. Because there is no loophole. When God said that he created us all in his image, that's the truth. Had the church, those who were Christian, who were God-fearing in the very beginning, said that can't happen, it probably would not have happened. So you move from there, you move to Reconstruction, and you get to the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation. Tony Evans already told you that there were clauses that were inserted that would allow people to bypass the 13th Amendment and still continue to treat people wrong. You've heard of the celebration called Juneteenth. You probably heard about it this year because they made quite a bit out of it this year. That's a celebration that happens on June 19th because it took almost 2 years for the Proclamation of Emancipation to get to Texas. So those who were enslaved in Texas were not freed until 1865. And they don't know why it took so long. Maybe the messenger was killed along the way. Maybe the owners were trying to get through a couple more harvests before they actually freed those who were enslaved. But that's a part of our history. And the church never stood up, or very, very, very seldom stood up to say anything about it. You had your abolitionists, and they were usually Mennonites. They were Quakers. We call them Friends today. And most of the slave owners were Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian and Episcopal, which blows my mind, because when black churches were started, and you do know that the black church is the child of a racist white church, because when we were released by the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, we were not allowed to go into those white churches. We could not be equal with them, so we had to start our own churches. That's a part of our history. Then you get to the segregation laws. We call them the Jim Crow laws. And you do know that Jim Crow was a derogatory term for black people. And they had the laws that were designed to intentionally keep black and whites separated from one another. And the church never stood up to say that should not be. Just didn't. And so it continued. And so in 1986, I went to Mississippi for the first time, and I traveled there with a white gentleman, another pastor. And I was shocked to find that the black women that we were there to observe a ministry that was started by John Perkins, Dr. John Perkins, who's considered the father of the Christian Community Development Ministry or movement here in America. And the black women were not allowed to go to the Bible study at the white church, even though it was publicly advertised. And you would have thought it was 1946 rather than 1986. In 2013, in July of 2013, my wife and I were in New York for a brief vacation. And we were in Times Square. And if you've ever been to Times Square, it's shoulder to shoulder people. And on that particular Saturday, George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. There was a 1,000-person march that came down the street blocked traffic in every direction. You couldn't get in, you couldn't get out, you couldn't move at all. That was a Saturday. The next day was Sunday. My wife and I went to a very well-known church that happened to be pastored by a white gentleman. And the church is at least 1/3, if not more, African-American, Hispanic, got Asian, and obviously whites in the church. And not one word was uttered about the Trayvon Martin Zimmerman case. Not a prayer for peace, not a prayer for reconciliation, not a prayer for healing, not a prayer. And I was just shocked and flabbergasted that this church led by this person did not even acknowledge the pain that the country was in at that time, particularly African American. And it was just an illustration again for me of how our silence has added to some of the problems historically. And we only do this because if you get to the back of Jemar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise, he has what he outlines what he calls the ARC, the ARC, the Arc of Justice and Reconciliation. And the A is for awareness. He said, we've got to make ourselves aware of what our reality is. And it's not designed to punish anyone or to make anybody feel bad, but to enlighten us so that we can do better, right? The R is for relationships. You got to start relating to people. We don't treat each other fair because we're not family. When Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, I was in junior high school. And I remember going to school because I was so angry and so mad the next day. And we started jumping on, beating up, spitting on, kicking white boys down the stairs. We were brutal to them. I don't remember doing anything to the little girls, but we were wrong and hard to the boys. And when I came to Jesus, because that was in my BC days before Christ, when I came to Jesus and I started engaging the Word of God, and the Holy Spirit started speaking to me, I realized that the reason it was so easy for me to mistreat those fellas was I did not see them as individuals created in the image of God. And when we fail to see people as God sees them, it becomes easier to mistreat them. And so we have it in our history. And so we don't want to hide from it. We want to acknowledge it so that we can move beyond it, right? There's they're tearing down a lot of monuments now, right? I don't agree with the tearing down of monuments. I don't like what they stand for, some of them, but I don't want this country, I don't want our history removed from our presence. I want people to always remember where we were, what was, so we never repeat it again. Because if it's out of our mind, out of sight, then it's a lot easier to repeat the things that ought not to be repeated because they're out of our sight. And that's a human issue again, right? It's a human issue. If I don't see it, well, maybe it didn't really happen. It can't be that big of a deal, right? Anyway, I've said enough about that. I just wanted to say the church had a role in our racial history, and now we have an opportunity to change that and to shift that and to move into a place of healing with that. Somebody asked a question. I need to make sure that, because I don't think I hit that question I said I wanted to get to a little earlier.
While you're looking, I'll jump in here. The other area that I think the church is complicit in, one of the areas that we get caught in is we have made economic well-being a God over separation from the gospel. So in our early years of ministry, we had a number of folks that called us and said, we want to come do evangelism work down in the urban core. We really want to come and support you guys and do evangelism work. And I would often, if I was feeling sassy or obnoxious, I would say, really, that's interesting. Where do you think the most church community of Seattle is? And what cultures would you say have the most connection to the kind of gospel or the church community? And people would say, well, Black or Hispanic and I said, where would be the least churched community? Talk about Medina or the folks that are in Issaquah Plateau going skiing on the weekends or whatever, nothing against skiing, but why don't we do evangelism to Medina? Why wouldn't we do a work project to Medina to build relationships with folks to share the gospel? Why is it that we always choose communities of color to do evangelism in? might it have more to do with our view of wealth? And if, life is good and you're wealthy, then you don't need God. And that we wrap, as the church, we wrap so much around. So I would agree, our original sin being more of a sin of greed than of racism or of slavery. But I also see that it's continued to perpetuate today, that we think about doing evangelism. We immediately think about other cultures and poorer cultures, when probably the most unchurched community in our world are the rich and the famous. But we don't often think about, doing evangelism to wealth, because we don't think people need Jesus. And so race and economics are clearly tied together. And one of the months we'll have a conversation just about racism and economics, and where the comparisons are and where the ties are to economics. I posted just a minute ago 2 links, and both of those links take you. The one link takes you to our website and our landing page for this workshop, and there's a survey that you can click on to get to so you can click through the website and get to the survey. The second link is just a direct link to the survey. And we would love if everyone that's been on the call would go online and give us some feedback. And there's a place where it asks for your name and your email address. We want to continue to promote this to people. But we also, at this point, wanted to take a moment to open up the conversation. I think I also posted the last 2 questions. I may have to do
that again. Okay, someone asked earlier if I could repeat the two terms: cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. Cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. Cultural appreciation is when you actually see something in another person's culture and you appreciate it. Cultural appropriation is when you take that and try and make it your own. How many of you remember Bo Derek? Bo Derek was the white woman who started wearing braids. Well, anybody know who Eminem is? He's a little white cat who's a rapper. See, he took something that we created and made it his own. Now, because of the generosity of people and some of the folks involved, they've embraced him as a rapper. But in reality, that was something that he took. And Little Richard just died not long ago. And he said for years, they stole my music. I'm waiting for my paycheck. So that's what cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation is. We won't say much more about that. But I think there's another question.
Can you answer the C in ARC? You gave the A, the R, and the C. Can you read?
Yeah, the C is commitment. You're right. I'm sorry. A is for awareness. We grow in our awareness, right? That we have to educate ourselves, and you need to do some of that yourself. Don't call me. I mean, you can, but don't wear me out because I got to try to educate you. But you do some work on your own. Again, the R is for relationships. We got to build relationships, right? And then the C is there's got to be a commitment to this. And I've been praying a lot lately for stamina, because we can get weary in this work. And those of us who have been at it for a while are weary in many ways. But we have to pray that God give us stamina, because we're moving toward what God really wants for us. It's not our dream. It was not Dr. King's dream or Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. His dream was built on the dream of the King, and that we would actually be one. The other thing is, I want to say, I did make a comment about when I was talking about speaking the truth. I didn't say all parents were negligent. I said some were, because some people are overworked and they don't have time to check on their kids. They're working 2 and 3 jobs trying to keep the lights on and keep the rent paid, the water flowing, et cetera. But there are some who are negligent. And I can say that because I grew up in the neighborhood and the community. And I can tell you, I can actually, if you want to send me an offering and I'll send you a few names. Okay, I just wanted to say, I'm not a spoken generalization. I wasn't saying we were all we were all that way, because I know a lot of us, a lot of the kids that we work with Urban Impact came out of similar situations, but they got the support that they needed from us and others. And they are now lawyers and MBAs and counselors, and they're teaching. and they're doing pretty good things. All right. But some are struggling because they didn't get the foundation. And I've got some in my personal family who did not get the foundation. Every one of my nephews have been locked up multiple times. I'm talking about federal penitentiary because they didn't get from my sisters or their fathers, because their fathers weren't around, what they needed to be assets. And so they became liability. So I speak some of that out of personal experience, but there was one other.
Pastor, while you're looking for that one, Jonathan, if you could unmute, I'd love for you to explain a little bit more about the stories of, I'm assuming you're saying Woodrow Wilson, and some of the Princeton students. Oh, no problem. You saw if you were looking at the chat that he can't unmute and explain it. But again, it's how that this wrestle of how kind of the historic attitudes and behaviors of some of our recognized national leaders. We've never really acknowledged the negative sides of their leadership or their lives. You know, when I put on here on the chat box, we've started this Navigating White Identity series. It actually starts next Thursday night. We did a little precursor event a couple Tuesdays ago, but the idea is that white people have work to do to unpack some of this history and take ownership for some of our lifestyles and actions and attitudes that we can't always expect people of color to navigate us through that. But in that series, one of the things we looked at was the historic ramifications of some of these leaders: Benjamin Franklin, the four faces on Mount Rushmore of Washington and Jefferson, and Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, and how the lifestyles and the decisions they were making, where they came from, where they were bent in, and how they built this history of kind of white supremacist attitudes within our country. So I would invite you. I put it on there to invite you, to join us in that conversation. The link takes you to a registration page. You do have to register for that event, so we can send the link out to you. But it's good information. And if you are curious about that, what I was asking Jonathan to log into, he gave us a link so we can dig in further if we want more information on that. I'm going to invite us. We've got about 15 minutes left. If you have a specific comment, a specific question, and you want to unmute, I would just ask that you not take up the whole 15 minutes. And so if you can ask your question briefer and quicker than either Harvey and I can speak, unmute, and we invite you to engage.
Oh, I just have a question as it pertains to the church. Why is Jesus always shown as a white man? Having been to Israel and to where Jesus was born, the people there, Palestinians, are not white. So I'm just Jerusalem. So I'm curious why that's always been fostered historically, because it seems like a piece of racism to me.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. In fact, it's shocking to me. And I won't tell the church, but there's a prominent African-American church in downtown Seattle where the pulpit is a classic, I will say, Baptist pulpit. And right up behind it is this beautiful picture of a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus. That's kind of the historic picture we've often seen. I'm actually on a call tomorrow night with a Samoan community, and the topic is white Jesus and how do we wrestle with this idea of white Jesus. Honestly, the dominant culture coming from the printing press era and English Northern European community begin to pictorially display what they saw of themselves in the participants in the scriptures. I was 28 years old, and a little old white lady was teaching at a Christian Community Development Association convention, and she said, she started talking about the people of color in the Bible, and I went, what do you mean? And she said, like the Ethiopian eunuch was from Ethiopia, he was black, and I had an aha moment because I'd heard about the Ethiopian eunuch, I talked about the Ethiopian eunuch, I knew where Ethiopia was, but I never thought about the fact that the Ethiopian would have been a black man. And that the gospel actually went to Africa through the Ethiopian eunuch before it ever went to Rome and began to get whitewashed by the Roman community. People have historically begin to see Jesus in the view of their own culture. There's a beautiful, I wish I had the link, description of, I think it's Jane, I can't remember the name, but he's an artist that has basically redone the drawings of all the biblical characters in beautiful Egyptian and African features. And other than he has Jesus in great woolen dreadlocks, it's really powerful. And I've often thought, what changes in my faith if Jesus is a black man, or looks like Saddam Hussein is probably a little more appropriate, versus, what if Moses was really a black pharaoh in Egypt? Why is it easier to see a white Jesus? And why is that historically? This call on Friday is actually pretty tense for the Samoan community, because they've always identified the Jesus to be like the missionaries who brought the gospel to Samoa. And so they see white Jesus as a pretty powerful feature. So it's just an intentional whitening of kind of spiritual leaders, Ross. It's a wrong description. The Bible says woolen hair and bronze feet. Those are the only two physical characteristics we know about.
But it is appropriation, is it not? Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is why I don't have a picture of a black Jesus either. Because some would argue that Jesus was obviously black, because when they went down into Egypt to spare the baby Jesus, they couldn't tell he was there. Really? Yeah.
He was definitely Middle Eastern, and they could cross and translate between Middle Eastern and Egypt. There's also a lot of history you can study about the lightening of the Jewish community, the European Jewish community, that actually then moves back to Israel, comes back very a lighter hue, a lighter complexion, because the intermingling with the Jewish community. And so there's a lot of study there that the Jewish community as well is a much historically darker community.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Harvey, could you go back to the, was a comparison you were going to make between poor whites and
yes.
Black Africans? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Woo! Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Okay. So I find that one of the toughest people groups to talk about white privilege with are poor whites. In fact, I got a good friend whose father would say he was actually homeless growing up. They were without home for a while. And so he's going, what do you mean white privilege? I think the problem with that is that we tend to singularly tie privilege to socioeconomics. So if we say we don't have money, then we don't say we're privileged. But poverty in a stricter sense is not just the absence of substance, it's the absence of access and options and opportunity. And so my friend who was white, when he talked to his dad about it, he said, Dad, but wouldn't you agree that while you may not always had enough food, or you may have been homeless for a period of time, that you still had an advantage over Black poor people? And his father finally said, yeah, because he didn't think about the advantage he has in terms of education. He didn't think about the advantage that he had in terms of the political system. He didn't think about the advantage that he had going to restaurants. My dad was in the military. If he were alive, he'd be 94 years old. And he told stories of being in the military, in uniform, going to a restaurant with one of his white counterparts. He had to go around the back to get his food while the white servicemen went through the front. And so that individual never thought about privilege or advantage, if you will, in those other terms. And at some point, we got to expand the connection to be more than just economics and finances.
It's good. I think it also gets back to the sense that we think often individually versus collectively. Yep. And I want to be held accountable just for my actions. I don't want to be held accountable for all of the other white people in the world. But the reality is, when you look at the numbers and the statistics, we see that 30% of the African-American kids in our schools are not reading it, or are only 30% are reading at grade level, whereas every other ethnic group is higher than that. We have to realize that that's not just an individual, this teacher can't teach issue. It's an issue that the system is broken and not working well, and the system has privileges to whites. Even though a poor family, poor people still have the opportunity to excel and kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make it.
We do, and we have.
Yeah.
The other thing we have to consider also is the fact that we have an Oprah who is probably a single woman who's a billionaire Black, right? Bob Johnson, who started BET, Black Entertainment Channel, who, by the way, sold it for over $1 billion. You got, I just forget his name. He's on Shark Tank. He started a clothing company called FUBU, For Us, By Us. FUBU was short. He sold it for mega millions. You had Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson, and you got Magic Johnson, and you've got the former president of American Express was African American. There used to be an African American who was president of the McDonald's Corporation. I think the current president of Carnival Cruise Line, which owns Princess and Holland America and a few others, happen to be African American. So people would say, well, how can you say there's still racism? Because look at them. Now, I do look at them up there, and I look at the masses down here. And I look at policies that tend to lock people into a lower status in life. We like to pride ourselves on our public welfare system. But the welfare system was one of the things that put Black fathers out of the family because they didn't have enough to make it. And in order for the family to get money, the father had to leave so the mother can get aid for dependent children, right? And that system in many ways kills the drive and the ambition and the vision of people in that system because they become so dependent on that, they don't even try to get out. And again, I'm talking about experience. Every woman in my side of the family, starting with my grandmother, was on welfare, all except one. I had one aunt who always worked, and they were healthy as anybody else. But the system aided them to the point that one of my younger cousins had 10 kids, and at one point, she made more money on welfare, or received, I should say, more money on welfare than I received working in ministry. And so some of the policies that we have in place that we say are really good and helpful don't actually help us. You've heard of Title I schools, right? Title I schools are these schools that get extra money because the kids are underperforming. If those kids start to perform well, guess what? That school loses that money. So then you have to wonder, is there a reason why these kids don't achieve, or is there a reason why only 34% of them are reading at grade level? Because I know a woman who turned a school around, and in 2 years, her school, which was primarily African American, outscored every elementary school in the district in reading and math, and they put her out of that school.
Because a few parents complained.
Say again?
Because a few parents.
Yeah, because a few white parents at that.
Yes.
And it just, and so at some point we have to expand our understanding of how the system actually works. And so it's hard, it is a little more difficult to talk about white privilege, if you will, than somebody who is not as endowed economically.
Hey, Harvey, yeah. I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, you've been doing this work for a long time, Harvey, and working with churches, and maybe it's a little early to make conjectures about what you think is different right now in the white church, or if you're really seeing any different. I see a lot in the regular, young people's friends. I'm not, and I see some comments, that maybe I didn't see in my white church, but I'm not convinced that there is the change going on that's really necessary. But what's your take on it, since you've been for a long time? So I'm asking you to what's your feeling about the response of the white church in this moment versus 10 years ago?
Okay. In this moment, I would say until George Floyd, it was status quo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. But I think something happened at the death and murder of George Floyd. I think the whole world saw this heinous thing occur. I think the whole nation gasped, oh my goodness. And it has literally opened the door for much more dialogue about this than we've ever been willing to have. And I see this as a window of opportunity that I would say God is giving us to walk into this thing so we can correct some things that have been off for so long. And it's going to shake us out of our state of complacency. It's going to shake us out of our state of complicity. It's going to shake us out of what we consider normal. And it's causing us to look more at what was God's original intent for us. So if you ask me, because I've been in this work a long time, and I've been really displeased in some ways, because what I've observed is this, is even when whites come down to help blacks, they always help, they don't engage the same way with blacks who don't need them as much. They gravitate to the weaker, broken, more underserved, if you will, black people, and they don't engage. And I often say, as Dr. Perkins would say, that real racial reconciliation assumes equality.
Yeah.
Assumes equality. And I've seen that way too much, because in my own congregation, where it has been 40% white for years, we noticed that there are certain whites who would not engage with my wife, who has a doctorate degree in education, would not engage in the same way with the woman who's a manager at Microsoft. Oh, but they gravitated to the little welfare mother. And part of that might have been, well, they need more help. But it feeds into our mentality that we're going to help people. We don't see them as having the potential to be equal. And if they're equal, then okay, they're on their own. And there's something a little disturbing about that attitude. And I think that's one of the things that we need to challenge in this season. So my hope is that because this door is opening, more people are willing to have this conversation, that we can, again, build our awareness, begin to build the right relationships, then have the commitment that we really need to move this dial and move this thing forward. I don't know if that gets at your question. You have something else you want to add to that?
No, I actually, being involved in a church that's been serving the Hilltop community in Tacoma for so long, you know, I wonder how much of what you just articulated is there.
Yeah.
You know, and to actually having the courage to challenge that if it's there.
Yeah, let me give you this illustration. I was watching PBS, it might have been in the 90s, because I know it was in Seattle. And they did a special on probably the largest white church, Baptist church in Dallas, Texas. And the pastor was also, I think he had a commentary, and I won't mention his name because he's probably in heaven right now. But I was shocked when he said out loud on camera that he gave mission to support to black churches so they would stay out there because we didn't want them in here. He didn't want them in Dallas in his church. So he said, we give support so they can stay out there where they belong. And I was so shocked by that, to hear a well-known, high-profile pastor say that out loud on TV. But again, it shows just how much we have to undo so we can become what God is calling us to be.
Thank you.
I would add in there, Don, too, that if this conversation we're having today is, 101 or 201 in a college course, the question you just asked about and that Harvey identified, where white folks are more apt to engage with any culture or other cultures that they perceive have a need for them, is deeply rooted in our internalized superiority that the white community feels. If they can't help, then there's no reason for them to necessarily engage if they can't be of service. And the idea of engaging peer-to-peer with people of color, we see that all the time in the work that we're doing at Urban Impact, where folks are very willing to engage when they can be a helper. When it comes down to just engaging as peers, or just engaging with business people, or just engaging because relationships are good, there's a whole different level of hesitation. And I think, honestly, white folks are pretty intimidated by people of color that are successful, people of color that are more intellectual, people of color that are just plain smarter than they are. And they tend to engage differently. And it just points to me to this deep-seated issue in our own psyche that if I don't have a way to help, if I don't have a way to be needed, then I'm going to go find somebody that I can help because I have a need to feel superior or a need to feel helpful. I think they come from the same root, and it's a harder and much deeper thing to unpack, to think of engaging with peers and engaging with, and I would say it's the work that most of us can do on our own in our jobs, is connect relationship with peers.
I would add to that is as a ministry practice and philosophy, Urban Impact has adopted development over rescue mentality, because we're not just interested in rescuing people. We want to see them increase their capacity so that they can do for themselves what they've had to rely on others to do so often. So if we desire to help people, it needs to be done in a way that moves them forward and upward. It should never be designed to keep them where they are. And this is what we have done down through the years, giving them just a little bit, satisfied, but it didn't increase their capacity. And it comes out of this fixed pie mentality where we think, oh, we're going to run out. I mean, America alone ought to be able to tell you, stuff don't run out, baby. God keeps giving us new ideas and new ways of doing things, and we just keep increasing. But we have this mentality that I'm going to help, but I'm just enough to kind of maybe salve my own guilt, if you will. But we want to help people in a way that moves them up and about. So we want to build the capacity of those that we engage with. That's got to be primary. Is this going to help them move forward? Is it going to aid them, again, to be not just dependent, but interdependent? We have a lot of systems that create dependency. And we have to break that attitude. And there are people with my paint job who are starting to be much more discerning. And we're asking tougher questions about everybody, right? Everybody. And if you have a policy that you want to set forth that does not move people forward and upward, I'm not interested in the policy. If it's just going to help them maintain their current status, keep your policy, right? Keep it in your pocket, keep it in your pen. We don't need it, because we need to do things that help people flourish, because that was God's idea. In the very beginning, what did he say in Genesis? He said, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. And he said, I didn't want you to stay flat. I want you to be fruitful and multiply, right? And when you look at Psalm 8, it says, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You know what I mean? And he talks about when I consider the heavens and all that you've done and the work of your fingers, who are we that you're mindful of us, that you even think about us? Yet you have made us a little lower than the angels. And you have given us leadership, rulership, if you will, over all of your creation. And to me, that says that the way God sees us, all of us, not just some of us, he sees us as people who have incredible potential and capacity. And every kid that's born have capacity until we drive it out of them. And so we want to build people, because that's what God wants. And that's what we're aiming for. So I started by saying that that in this talk is designed to help pull us together so we can live more into being the family of God that he had called us to be. And I think when we can get it together, we will then have the credibility we need to speak to the larger culture and society and say, time's out for these things that we know don't build people. Time out for these things that undermine the inherent dignity that God has placed in all of us. Time out for these things that denigrate and demean and deny people. We're going to do things in a way that really lift all of us. Does that make sense to anybody but me?
Totally.
Yes, and I want to give I want to put a pause here for a quick second. A commercial announcement. The evaluation, it looks like the Google form doesn't work very well, but if you go to the urbanimpactseattle.org link that I just put in the chat, Wrestling with Reconciliation, that link will take you to the landing page. On the landing page, there's a survey. It's the same link that you should be able to click on the survey. If it doesn't work, I apologize. We tested it, it was working, and I don't understand technology if it doesn't. The other link is the Navigating White Identity seminar, also on our website. You can take a look, you can register there, and you can make your comments. It is 8:35, and we said we'd be over at 8:30. And I know our folks from Atlanta are hanging in there with us. It's 11:30 of your time. We appreciate it. But we wanted to, we'll stay on for a little while longer if people still have some questions. We wanted to formally end our time now. And then if people have to leave, they don't feel like they left the Zoom call and left the table. But we recognize that we want to honor that time. So we'll stay on, we'll continue engaging. Please try to check the survey, give us some feedback. First Tuesday of August, we'll be back, and first Tuesday of September, and we'll start doing, I keep saying Tuesday, first Thursdays. We'll keep doing this on the first Thursdays for a season. So thank you very much. We appreciate you being here.
Final thing.
And I'm going to let Harvey have the last word because I'm a good submitting member.
I am hoping that in this season that we can do things differently than what's been done all these other years. Right? We've got to move the dial. And I think we need a more of a gospel response to what's happening. Right? Part of the issue is the Bible says in Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked, who can know it? And part of what we're talking about are things that can only be changed when the heart is changed, when the mind is changed, right? And the people around us, if we're honest, if we're absolutely honest, what we tried in our humanness has not worked, which is why we find ourselves in this place every so many years. Every so many years, we find ourselves right back here. Perhaps it's time to give God's way a shot. So when we address this, let's not start with sociology, which is based on our brokenness and our fallenness, our fallen nature and our sin. Let's start this conversation with what God had in mind. And that was that we would all flourish, that we would all be productive, that we would all be affirmed and appreciated because we carry with us the imago Dei, the image of God. I'll quit because we could say more. So thank you again for joining us tonight.